President Jeffrey and the members of the Society, thank you very much for organising this conference and giving me the opportunity to speak. I want to congratulate you on your earnest efforts that has managed to pull in so many diverse speakers, so many diverse participants. It really feels like a big privilege to be here. I can't think of another meditation society run by graduate students that is as organised and as impressive as yours.
Thank you.
And also the fact that you've had the courage to create such a conference. And as I said to you, separately, I'm more than happy to collaborate in the future for any ventures that you may wish to do. I'm based in the Centre of Education Assessment. My Master's was also in Education Innovation and with a specialism in assessment. And really what I'm presenting you today is more where I think some of my postdoc and maybe beyond work will go. So I'm in this stage of conceptualizing this aspect. I am particularly interested in perhaps writing a book on this theme, and so hence you're going to hear some early stage thoughts, but they're thoughts based on several years of reading around these subjects. My spiritual background started off, I suppose, when I was 4 years old, when my mother began training in a Hindu form of meditation with the Brahma Kumaris in London. And we were fortunate that Delhi Janki, who's now 103 years old, she was the mentor at that time, and she's been a grandmother figure to me since that young age. So I trained with her. I currently live in Rugby, and so very close to here. And we then we learn for free from Delhi Janki, so we pass those classes on for free in Rugby too. So I'm coming from that spiritual mindset within my meditation practices. But my academic background and my work background comes in school support services, local authority services, and this type of public service role, particularly with children and young people. And I have tended to work with those considered more difficult, or those for whom the system has not quite fitted. That has been one of the areas. So alternative curricula, alternative approaches, these have been the things that I've done in the past. Today I'm going to argue that it's crucial within the education context, but I would go further and to say that you may find resonances in whichever background you find yourself, whichever situation you find yourself, both in professional and personal levels, to have a contemplative meditation while we live within a neoliberal paradigm, while we live within a neoconservative policy environment. I'm arguing today that those policy ideologies fuel the role of metrics, and everything we do in our life is actually influenced or controlled by number. Those metrics cause a pressure upon an individual, because in a neoliberal environment, the ideology is that you must put pressure to perform on an individual in order to bring the best out of them. That pressure to perform then leads to levels of fear, and that fear then leads to an individual compromising their own ethics and values, simply because they have to develop two parts of themselves. And this is known as cognitive dissonance, what I believe in and what my role requires me to perform for. I'm arguing that that cognitive dissonance leads to a compromise in our conscience and our ethics. And it is crucial that we spend the time in meditation to reflect. And as I put this PowerPoint together, and I do hope it's come across okay, but I'm more than you can appreciate that in a PowerPoint, you can only put a little bit in. So anything that any of you wish to have further information afterwards, I'm more than happy. My email address is in the book, and I can send you further resources and reading and so on, and materials. Because as I was going through them, I was looking at myself and thinking, yeah, I've been really unethical in many of my practices. So I found it quite a useful process just to reflect on. My main sources are these 4 articles. I am making other references, and I'm more than happy if another reference is something you're interested in. If you email me, I will send it to you. But these are the 4 main articles that I'll be referring to. The top one is actually the head of my department and my supervisor, so Professor Joanne Baird and Dr. Victoria Elliott is my first supervisor. And they are editors of the Oxford Review of Education, and I would like to turn your attention to this issue of October 2018, because they did a special issue on the metrics in education, and I would recommend having a read of all of those articles. The second, by Michelle Meadows and Beth Black, is also from that issue. And then the third, the Woodbine and Amrita Lingam, that's one again that I've selected not in that issue, it's a separate one. And then of course I would plug my own piece, but it was a really interesting literature review that I was asked to do in the department, looking at how the effects of international tests have upon teachers and how in different jurisdictions these things are pushed and measured. For example, when the Thailand had a low ranking within international tests, they actually retested all of their maths teachers, and they had to reach a certain percentage or they lost their license to teach maths. But they were allowed to teach other subjects that are considered lesser. Let's begin with the definition of neoliberalism. And neoliberalism really came into the theoretical forms in the late 1930s. You may be familiar with economic theorists like Hayek and others, and it has its centrality upon the belief in the market. And so it's like a form of liberalism, but liberalism taken in the form of competitiveness, atomization, and then what you're doing is you're creating certain circumstances which then enable some prosperity through that system. Neoliberalism then leads to quantification because it has an economic drive around it. Economics, of course, is a lot about econometrics, and so that then feeds into that process. About a year and a half, 2 years, 2016, so it would have been October 2016, I had the privilege to go to the House of Lords for a 40th anniversary event on the Ruskin speech. And the Ruskin speech was given by the British Prime Minister James Callaghan in 1976. And to give you an idea, that was the very first time a British Prime Minister gave a speech on education. Up until 1976, education was not the realm of politicians as such. Lord Donoghue, his private secretary, was one of the members of the panel that day, and David Blunkett, a former education secretary, was also on that panel, along with Oxford's Professor Richard Pring. And what David Blunkett and Lord Donoghue were explaining was, up until then, only the non-ambitious politician went for the education role. Because education was controlled by the profession. It wasn't a political thing. However, what prime ministers learned, Harold Wilson, others, Lord Donoghue was explaining, was that you actually, as a prime minister, have very little control over your economy. You make lots of promises that you'll do this and that, but the economy is based upon market forces. So the actual power within the central government is very limited. So as they were problematizing, Callaghan came to this conclusion that the one thing that could be controlled is education. So then education became connected with the future prosperity. So you have this connection between, what is the purpose of education? It's to train in skills so that our economy boosts, so it becomes connected. That, I will argue, is the ushering in of this neoliberal paradigm within the UK education system. 3 years later, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, and then there were a whole series of changes that occurred. And then towards the end of her term and into John Major's term in the early 90s, the 1993 Education Act was particularly significant in that it was formalising these processes of school league tables, for example. And so suddenly what you have is it began to incentivise schools to remove themselves from local authority control, become directly controlled by the central government, receive their funding directly from the central government, thus creating competition with each other. Prior to that, you just went to the school usually that was nearest to you. However, this was a system of a market that they wanted to introduce. So a parent could choose where to educate their child within the state system, and the money follows the people. So the more successful school can pull in the pupils and the parents that will then also boost their performance in the school league tables. And this is that whole paradigm. So that all begins with that neoliberal paradigm. Sorry. Once you begin to introduce that sort of thing and you're devolving monies into these bodies, then of course you have to hold them accountable. And so then accountability metrics come into it. So the entirety of a pupil's education might be redacted onto their grade at GCSE. Then that grade, A, B, C, whatever, determines the performance of the teacher, and that then determines the performance of the school. So what else they learned is redacted. And so this is the role of metrics. The individual becomes a number, it becomes a cell within a spreadsheet. And so then, for many years, Ofsted inspections mainly involved going into the head teacher's office and looking at a spreadsheet. Now, they do go into the classroom for 15 minutes. And that's how they will judge the quality of education. So all the way throughout my studies, as I was choosing my courses, I'd worked for a number of years, and then after about 10 years of work or so, then I went and did my master's. I became more and more convinced that we're an assessment-driven system, so this was so crucial to understand. Now, as I mentioned, it's come in, and there's a reference here to Power in 1997, and he was coining this term, the Audit Society. And 1997, we had our next Conservative Prime Minister, Tony Blair, in the Labour Party guys, who continued, and he introduced forms what's known as managerialism right throughout the public service. So these concepts of the market, measurement, metrics flooded right the way throughout our society. And those of you, I would say, private sector, public sector, probably now, it's so normal. Could you even imagine not having targets, not having supervisions, not having appraisals? These things really came into the public sector at around that time. So I have this in the wrong order. So this term, performivity, was coined by Leotard in 1984. And performivity is this constant state of the individual where they feel they must constantly be performing. Staying where you are is not good enough. You must be getting better all the time. You're not allowed to just be. That would never be enough. You must be constantly striving. And what will be measured is determined by policymakers or by different bodies, your employer, and so on. So there'll be certain things that will be measured. And then those are the things that you will perform for. So, for example, my most common angst when I interview teachers is the narrowing of the curriculum. There are some schools, some primary schools within England, that don't really teach science anymore. I don't know if you know that. Because what's actually tested at the end of year 6 is literacy and numeracy. That began with those literacy and numeracy strategies in the early 2000s, and now is even stronger. The last year, spelling became part of the test. So rather than learning some music and learning how to play a guitar in 6 hours, what happened was that let's learn how to spell things correctly. Rote learning. Times tables is now tested as well. These types of things. So performivity comes into it. What happens is that then the teacher or the professional, instead of doing what they love, which is presumably teaching, presumably caring, and again, I'm situating this within education, but perhaps you will listen to these concepts within your own situations, it becomes almost a tick boxing exercise. And so professionals then spend a lot of time for the audit society. What papers do we need? How do we evidence what we're doing? Because it's the evidence that will determine whether any good. And so we move people away because we're measuring only a few things. Of course, you cannot measure everything. This, I argue, leads to something called dissonance. And dissonance is really where we become split within our personalities. And I've always struggled with this within my professional life. And I've never been that good at it, really. Some people seem to be totally fine with being able to perform and succeed within that system, and then separate their own private, personal views and beliefs. I'm someone where it would always bother me inside. So what happens is that there's a dissonance created within the professional as to, they might think, well, I'm going to go into teaching to benefit this child in this way. I'm going to go into social work to benefit in this way, and so on and so forth. But actually what they're doing in their job is not actually what they think they should be doing and what they might want to do. So you're imposing evaluation systems upon them. Baroness Honora Neal, she gave the Wreath Lectures back in 2002 on accountability, well worth a listen, it should be in the BBC archives. And she's arguing in there, and my supervisor refers to this in her article, that then leads to increased mistrust also between professionals. Because if I'm being measured and I'm feeling that pressure, I'm looking at you as well with those measures in mind. Are you doing? Are you performing? And so you end up with a system of mistrust. Could be between manager and employee, could be between colleagues, and so on. Then you have the effects upon the receivers. For example, young people don't necessarily like to think that they are a C. What do you know about geography? Right, you're a C. What does that mean? So it can aid in any things. It doesn't tell you what they know. Really? Well, what does that mean? A C. And so on. Professionals as well, but you might be in this stark, because neoliberalism pervades every area of our life, and therefore paying the mortgage means that I have to put up with keeping my job. So it could be a choice there. If I really want to be authentic, I might have to leave my job. But I can't afford to do that because of house prices and rents and so on and so forth. And then that results in our interactions with each other having less meaning. So Peck 2002 speaks of all of us find being on treadmills of someone else's making, coerced and constrained by a combination of competitive relations and superordinate rule systems. But Dr. Elliott, she brings this across, and Professor Baird brings this across, I think, really powerfully. I'm sorry I haven't got the reference on the slide. What they say in this quote, the insidious thing about them is that they do not just control us externally. We do not only accept these norms as individuals, but we also internalize them as part of our identity. And then we begin to define ourselves in relation to that. So some of you will be familiar with the work of Michel Foucault and so on. What do teachers report? So in 2012, the Association of School and College Leaders surveyed teachers, and they spoke about that pressure. 1/3 reported that the pressure could compromise either their professionalism or their integrity. Some teachers reported that they manipulate results. For example, inappropriate levels of support to pupils preparing courses. So these things can be really subtle. They might look acceptable. Oh, I'm helping them. But I'm helping everyone equally. And if you're helping someone more than others, does that not need reflection? Teachers can sometimes lose sight. So there's a quote there from Astor. So we're achieving the proxy goals of passing tests, hitting targets, climbing league tables. They risk losing sight, teachers risk losing sight of education's higher purposes. What do universities report? Academic dishonesty is reported in different ways. You get severity of some levels, but of course all of us in universities have to do ethical training, follow ethical procedures, but still there's many different distortions of how much we're practicing those ethics. And I'll skip. So dealing with those pressures, but there's nothing on offer to say at the university usually, are you feeling really pressurized by the culture of performivity? Would you like to talk about it and how it's affecting you as a student? I'm arguing that there should be contemplative reflection on this. This is from the Woodbine article that I mentioned earlier, and they did a controlled experiment, and they found they did it with business and accounting students, and they did find that many of them reported different practices that they had used in order to, I mean, what constitutes ethical behaviour and what doesn't? Does sharing each other's notes, is that ethical, is that not? And so on and so forth. So all of these things, all of these practices require us to have a lot of reflection. Michelle Meadows, I referred to earlier, they did a survey of teachers, interviewed teachers, and you can see up there what they were looking at was, I've only included a couple of their columns. So the first one is teachers who reported having experienced it, and then whether they regarded that as okay. So again, I won't run through all of those, but you can see that as I was reading that myself, I was thinking, did I do that? So some things might be really unacceptable. So for example, there's a pressure on schools to get a certain number above a C grade at GCSE. So any pupils identified as a DC, called borderline, teachers invest, or schools will invest all of their effort to get them above the C, and then others get less attention, naturally. So how ethical? So most teachers go, no, that's wrong. But then other practices, perhaps we're not reflecting upon. And then with regards to pupils and what did students, we had school leaders and then teacher activity, sorry for that, misreading. And so the teacher activity here as well. Again, what is experienced and then what is acceptable. And what they found is someone who's doing a certain practice will always justify that practice. They'll have an ethical language to justify it. So in essence, what I'm arguing, these studies look at things like, is it right that there could be extra tuition? is that not gaming the system in a certain way? So we're saying certain people with certain resources get a certain amount. Then selection of education. Some schools are allowed to select pupils and they can get the most middle class, the most mobile parents and their pupils into their schools. So thus, we're distorting the system. How ethical is this? And I think it's absolutely crucial that teachers, leaders, students, everyone involved within the education system is using a contemplative meditation that's keeping our conscience active and finding methods to do that. It takes a great deal of courage, I think. And this is a quote from my mentor, Dali Janki. We have to understand the subtle role of the conscience. Our minds can come under the influence of our senses. Between the mind and the intellect is the conscience. We know right from wrong, but when we repress our conscience, the intellect doesn't work properly. Keep the conscience alert. I like that concept, that the role of a contemplative meditation is to try and keep our conscience alert as to what practices we might have inculcated into our being simply because that is the environment of performivity that we live under. Thank you.
Enough time for questions.
I'd like to just kind of publicly appreciate the reinsertion of morality into discourses around mindfulness and meditation. I think it's obviously from the Buddhist foundations that Western mindfulness came from. Morality is an integral part, and we seem to have lost it, left it behind as part of that kind of secularization of this practice, and bringing that back. It's especially in terms of kind of casting it against the often unnoticed ills of neoliberalism. I think it's really useful, and I'll look for that book. Let us know when it comes out.
Thank you so much for your comment and feedback. I am with you, so you've crystallized my feelings towards it too. I'm very grateful for the breakthrough that Buddhist traditions have made with making mindfulness more acceptable within our society. Because what it's going to enable us to do, we've got trials at the moment in some schools, actually, and you can see how those go. I know that there's a group in Parliament, for example, they meet on a cross-party basis, House of Lords and MPs, and they have meditation within there. Now, I think then we look at what's next. What's next for us? And this is, I think, my argument. Where I would like to take the research project, if it could be funded in a couple of years' time, is almost to link this with the national story. So I have this idea that we've kind of lost our sense of national stories. And what you end up with is like a vacuum, that vacuous images and vacuous comments and vacuous policies fill. So the national story is GDP. The national story is, it's always redacted and reducted. Well, this is what we're like. Well, people in the north are like this, people are like that. Now, it doesn't tell me anything. I suspect the national story is one of cognitive dissonance. I would like to perhaps explore the connection between cognitive dissonance and mental health issues, and the connection between those and addictions. I wonder whether alcohol, cigarette, drugs misuse is largely stemming from individuals experiencing cognitive dissonance that either they're conscious of or unconscious of, but must suppress for the ego, the face that they must present in front of the world. And it's in complete contrast to how we would teach a child. We would say, be yourself, go and be whoever you want. We would express that. And then they find, when they grow up, that they can't be. So our promise has become deceptive.
Yeah.
And this is my theorizing. And as I say, I'm at this early stage, but that's where I would like to move towards and go around the country talking, listening to people and discovering whether this is indeed the national story, and it could well be the global story.
you, Shailen, for an absolutely fantastic presentation, which has made, and I think I said to you at lunchtime, this has made me think, yes, you're talking about education, but I work in the health service and have done for 46 years, and we're in the same boat. You know, we work in A&E where we have a 4-hour target to get people out of a trolley, so we put them in a side room on a bed, and then we shift them into an emergency decisions unit, and then as soon as we possibly can, we're pushing patients out the front door when they should be kept in because they're so unwell. So within the NHS is exactly the same situation where we're all ethically trying to treat our patients and fighting this dreadful target-led system, which doesn't benefit anyone. So I think the sooner we bring mindfulness into the health service as well, and we are trying to do that, I think most of the clinicians are on board with this, but obviously we're fighting the management structure and the politicians. But it's just, I can't tell you how grateful I am to you for this presentation. It's made me fired up now. I'm going back to work tomorrow and I'm going to kick some butts, I think.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I think you've illustrated what I'm saying. I'd like to go and talk to people. So what you've just shared is exactly what I'd like to do. Is this the case?
Yeah.
Are we finding that this is actually the story of the NHS and all the different professions within the layers, within schooling, within housing, within local authority,
Social work.
and then yes, and within private sector as well? Why? And this is, I think, Professor Baird's and Dr. Elliott's point, that the insidious part of it is that, and Foucault talks a lot about this. So I would recommend Michel Foucault's reading, although it's quite dense. If you email me, I can always send you some stuff.
Sure.
That the insidious part of it is you believe there's no alternative.
Mm.
So any changes that are made are still within that neoliberal structure. No one's asking you, do you want to completely scrap everything and completely start again? It'll be adjustments, rearranging the tables and the chairs. And because it's been so many years since we knew anything else, that I feel that we've got all these generations now where it's just been part of them. And I think we've internalized it and we just spend our lives living this.
Would you be happy to share your presentation?
Yes, to come to the...
yeah.
Oh yes, I'll send it around. Yes,
Thank you.
No problem. Just email me.
Did you have a question? I think we will take one last question and then we'll move on to the next one.
I'm going to try and put this, it seems scattered in my mind, but I'm going to try and put it together. So, when we have someone like Michael Gove as Minister of Education saying that the country's had enough of experts, I suppose symbolically he's implementing the system and he's so clearly reinforcing the neoliberal values of profit and these sorts of ideas. What would you say to someone really hard on the right-hand side of things that was kind of would say it's about profit and there's no place for compassion in profit? How would you go about talking to somebody like that?
Okay, if you'd like to email me, I'm happy to send with you quite some sections. I've read quite a lot on this theme. I've written quite a lot, and there's sections of my PhD as well. So, in short, we live within a policy environment that is dictated by a think tank called Policy Exchange. And Michael Gove worked for Policy Exchange from 2003. Policy within England is not created in universities, it's not created within Parliament, it's created within think tanks. And Policy Exchange ties itself to the work of Hirsch. And Hirsch was one of the writers in the 80s and 90s that was fighting against the progressive education movement of the 1950s and 60s. And so hence, this conservative government that came in coalition in 2010 had actually prepared for about 7 years to bring this type of further marketization. And the irony of it is that in education, he thinks the opposite. He's emphasizing the expert. And so what he's arguing, you see, we have a habit of recreating the education we had. So Michael Gove went to grammar school in Oxford. David Cameron went to Eton and Oxford. Theresa May went to Oxford. So what happens is you think, well, I've had the most wonderful education, and I'm the Prime Minister, or I'm the Secretary of State. So the justification actually becomes from a personal perspective as well with policymakers. So there's a very interesting book called The Gove Legacy. Again, if you email me, I will send you different links and you can look into that.
Okay, I would like to join me to thank Shailen.